All right. Let's get started here. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays debate. My name is Joey Amiel, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the convener of public debate for the Brooks-Quimby Debate Council. The Brooks-Quimby Debate Council was founded in 1854, before the founding of Bates College itself, and has remained an important institution within the Bates community for the entirety of the college's existence. One of Bates' most esteemed alums, Dr. Mays, class of 1920, was president of the Bqdc during his time at Bates. Dr. Mays would go on to become the longtime president of Morehouse College, as well as an influential civil rights figure and a mentor to leaders such as Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. But during his time at Bates, Dr. Mays was refused admission to Delta Sigma Rho, the National Debate Honor Society, due to segregation. The organization wrote that the unification of Northern and Southern debate was more important than the integration of the activity. In 1920, when the Bqdc wrote them asking to reconsider their stance, Delta Sigma Rho went so far as to entirely ban Black debaters. After much back and forth between the Bqdc and the organization, 15 years after he graduated, Dr. Benjamin Mays became the first Black debater admitted to Delta Sigma Rho. Mays would say at the time, quote, "It is gratifying to know that Bates has kept on the job and that after many years of effort, she has won." Despite this victory, Delta Sigma Rho denied historically Black colleges and universities membership into the 1950s. Dr. Mays links the institutions of Bates and Morehouse, and this annual debate tradition is proof of his enduring legacy. But this story is also relevant because of this year's theme, confronting our history, justice for coming times. Both Bates College and the Bqdc entertain a narrative of egalitarianism and inclusivity that, when compared to the actual histories of both institutions, fails to live up to reality. We all have an imperative to continue to work towards an equal society and not to let our whitewashed histories blind us to everyday injustices. It is in this spirit of confronting history that we reconsider the Civil War, a war fought over slavery, and interrogate what we know and what we think we know. The motion this year is, "This House regrets the portrayal of the Union in the Civil War as a morally righteous actor." I'll stop here so as to not step on any arguments the debaters may make today. The format will consist of 4 constructive speeches, followed by an audience period in which you can ask questions, followed by 2 rebuttal speeches, which will incorporate answers to some of the audience questions posed. So make sure you send your questions in using the Q&A feature in Zoom. I want to stress today that the debaters did not get to pick the topic and did not get to pick their sides. Debate is unique in how it can foster a rich discussion, and we encourage you to continue that conversation even after the debate has ended. With that out of the way, I want to introduce today's debaters. Let's start with Government Bench, arguing an affirmation. Serving as Prime Minister from Morehouse College is Daniel Edwards. Daniel is a senior political science major from Dallas, Texas, and is the captain of the Morehouse debate team. His college debate experience has seen him represent the institution as one of the youngest debaters Morehouse has sent to the World University's Debating Championships, and he holds national titles in multiple debate formats. He's also active in student government and leads the Morehouse Moot Court team, the only HBCU moot court team in the country. He's seeking to continue his education in law school this upcoming fall. Debating as member of government from Bates College is Dylan Gyauch-Lewis. Dylan is a senior from Nashville majoring in economics and a quadruple minoring in anthropology, education, history, and German. He's the president of the Bqdc and secretary of the Garden Club. He won finals at both the Penn and Tufts tournaments in American parliamentary debate and was an octafinalist in the U.S. University's Debating Championship, as well as third speaker at the Smith American Parliamentary Tournament. On opposition bench is leader of opposition from Bates College, Samuel Melcher. Samuel is a senior double majoring in history and politics. He is the novice director on the Bqdc and is president of the Bates Musician Union. Samuel recently made it to elimination rounds of the United States University's Debating Championship and represented Bates at the World University's Debating Championship. And debating as member of opposition from Morehouse College is Caleb Strickland. Caleb is from Northwest Arkansas and is a sophomore sociology major with a concentration in sex, gender, and family studies. He is now a 2-time participant in the Morehouse Bates exhibition debate with a history of top speaker and debate placements at tournaments such as Brandeis, Vanderbilt, and King's IV. We especially want to thank Daniel and Caleb for debating today and continuing this tradition between our 2 schools. So without further ado, I call upon the Prime Minister for his first speech. Thank you.
Admittedly, this is a different format for all of us. Before everything goes out, thanks again to Bates. Thanks again to everyone in attendance. I believe we're at 107 participants on the Zoom now, so it's a very healthy audience. And with that, let's get started. I think it's especially important with the seditionist and armed insurrection that we saw at the Capitol just a few days ago to consider two things. And I posit to you two things. Firstly, that we either A, live in a world in which the South won the ideological war at the conclusion of the Civil War, or two, that the Union won and that the continuation of the victor's policies are one that are not ideologically different enough from the South insofar as the continuation of those policies still stands today. And insofar as the vices of slavery, racist exploitation, as well as in both our governorates, as well as in terms of the seditionist mobs that we've seen going against our own government, that we have to understand that the latter of those two scenarios is the one in which has happened. And that is why we regret the portrayal of the Union as the morally righteous actor within the Civil War, or as a morally righteous actor, period. We believe that the Union and the South were two sides of an ideologically similar coin, as evidenced by their pre-war conduct, as well as their conduct during the war, and finally, the means of creating policy and continuing that racist legacy immediately after the war, leading us to believe in a situation here in which believing that the Union is morally righteous creates a situation in which we believe that good has beaten evil in these situations, when truly good and evil are not necessarily too different within their ideological claims. Now, in terms of pre-war conduct, we see that if we look towards two individuals and how they've been analyzed both during the period immediately leading up to the Civil War, as well as immediately after in terms of that level of historical analysis, we see that if we were to take the two individuals who I suppose represent what we know today concerning the Civil War, John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. If we look towards the reactions of individuals within the North to John Brown, the abolitionist who led armed insurrections at places like Harper's Ferry and was one of the few individuals who openly believed in trying to enforce equality between races by whatever means necessary. If we look towards historical reactions, we can see that many within the North and many within what would later constitute to be the Union forces stated that he was insane. The prospect of fighting and putting one's life on the line to try and enforce and create an environment in which equality between Black and white in this country was something that would become the norm was equated with insanity, a mental disability. In fact, it was said by many senators at the time in the Union, in northern states, mind you, that John Brown was a man who had lost his mind and trampled upon everything that the United States government stood for. Now think about that statement for a second. When it comes to an individual who is willing to take up arms and lead an insurrection against the horrible institution of slavery and the abuses of Black Americans within this country, that in itself is considered by both the Union and the South to be something that is truly insane. But when we look towards somebody who's been seen as kind of the morally righteous poster boy for the Union, Abraham Lincoln, we can see that he has a long history of not necessarily being as ideologically consistent as our friend John Brown. We can see that in his own writings, he was pro-Black immigration, the idea of only allowing Black individuals within this country from a previous condition of enslavement to be free if they were sent back to Africa. This idea concerning this colonialist mindset in which the United States government felt that they were a racially homogenous country and ought to be one well into the future. And this was something Abraham Lincoln was firmly for. Furthermore, Lerone Bennett goes on to talk about this, and he states that when it comes to Lincoln and his legacy of racism, he stated that racism was his most deeply held belief. And we can see this even going as far back to the legal cases that Abraham Lincoln took as an Illinois lawyer, in which he would consistently represent individuals who had committed crimes against enslaved Black Americans, going so far as to even use enslaved Black Americans as payment and restitution for cases where he was ruled against within those settlements. But what are the impacts of this? Firstly, we see that these kind of pro-Black immigration lines are still consistent today to this idea concerning this love it or leave it mentality when Black Americans have rightful grievances against their government. But we also have the myth of this kind of ethereal white savior complex that we've seen within America today. This idea that civil rights heroes, like we wish to call them in this case, with Abraham Lincoln, have been kind of used to perpetuate this myth that racism ended on Juneteenth. I think that's even a flexible date for some white Americans in today's debate, saying that it ends with the Emancipation Proclamation, constantly using the justification that if Black Americans do not know somebody who was enslaved or cannot directly link themselves to that lineage, that their grievances against the United States government are not something that ought to be given credence. But then we also need to understand that during and immediately after the war, we see that the Union conduct was something that saw the rape and pillage of enslaved Black Americans all the same. We see that, according to Kim Murphy, when she writes for The Atlantic, that there were 450 documented counts of rape among Union soldiers within this instance. And what's very troubling about this is that she states that the number was probably 2 to 3 times higher because military justice did not account for the rape of enslaved Black women within these instances. And oftentimes, when Union soldiers would go through and liberate a town or liberate a city down south, that they would often take their own payment in the form of Black lives. Now, the impacts of this. Even when we look towards the continuation of Native American genocide and manifest destiny, like we've seen with the Sand Creek Massacre and the killing of 70 to 500 Native American men, women, and children, we see that the continual legacy here is that if history is written by the victors, and the victors in this instance are the Union, then we have to truly ask some critical questions of one, why do we see a continual situation in which manifest destiny and anti-Indigenous sentiment and anti-Black sentiment runs rampant in the military, but then also concerning attitudes or surrounding the nature of whiteness in its corporeality being something that can necessarily be abusive within the status quo. And then finally, the idea concerning the idea that the South is something that once it was beaten in the Civil War, it was relegated to this kind of historical backburner, this idea that the sentiments that they've had and held are not something that are occupied within the US military today. And so that's something that goes starkly in contrast with the stories of individuals like Vanessa Guillen, who was lost at Fort Hood due to the racism and kind of cancerous system that we've seen within the US military today, as well as other incidents that happen abroad, like the Mahmoudiyah incident in which we saw US service members raping a 14-year-old Iraqi girl. This idea that if history is written by the victors, and the victors in this instance are continuing a pattern of problematic abuses of individuals who they consider to be less than, that means that we have to beckon and truly ask questions that are tougher and further reaching than this kind of good versus evil, Black versus white scenario. And that is why we thoroughly regret the portrayal, of the Union as the morally righteous actor.
Excellent. Can everyone hear me okay? Certainly hope so. Definitely a little bit different doing it over this particular format. The first thing I want to extend, of course, is an incredible acknowledgement of the privilege that it is to be doing this, not only for the first time, but the second time. I think these are the sort of days that the Bates community strives for, to become a better version of all of us, and to be someone who's contributed in such a small part to something that is so significant is, of course, one of the greatest privileges of my Bates career. Secondly, just a big thank you to Joey, to Morehouse, and to everyone else involved in holding this event. It's a shame we can do it in person, but I'm sure that the Morehouse debaters aren't missing the cold right about now. So without further ado, I'm firstly going to talk about recharacterization, bring some constructive points, and if I have time, maybe a little bit of rebuttal to the excellent points that Daniel brought you earlier. Great. Okay. First things first, this is a debate about the portrayal of the Union and not the actions of said actor. If this were a debate about whether or not the Union was morally good, I think we would very clearly lose, because the truth is that not everything is black and white, as Daniel leaves you with at the last argument of his speech. But another misconception I want to clear up is this idea is that if we make things morally muddled, that people will instead move left and move towards a progressive understanding of the Union versus a more regressive understanding. I think if the last couple of weeks have shown us anything, is that when you have discussions about basic American institutions, they don't move towards progressivism. Most people move towards conservatism, hate, and xenophobia. That is something that I think we've learned in the last few weeks. Great. So what are we defending here, and what are our arguments that we think make this a better circumstance when we see the Union as a morally good actor? Firstly, what do people actually see the Union for in status quo? We think there are three main characteristics of the Union that if you ask someone on the street, they would tell you about. They would say, firstly, they defeated the Confederacy as their most important goal. Secondly, they were responsible in part for the abolition of slavery. And thirdly, they were able to continue the unity of the United States into the one that we see now. We think ultimately, questioning those fundamental beliefs over whether or not those things were good is going to lead to a much worse United States than would be if we left those in status quo. What does this look like? We think firstly, let's discuss what a creation myth is, because the union, the way that the union is discussed in classrooms and is discussed in interpersonal conversations is not of huge historical depth, but rather a conversation based on the morals that come out of those stories. Creation myths are more things like stories we tell our children to describe what America is. George Washington crossing the Delaware, Jefferson penning the Declaration of Independence, or the Constitutional Convention. What's critical about these events is not the historical accuracy, but the morals that they particularly indicate. It was MLK himself in his most famous speech who turned the words of the Declaration of Independence into a dream for all people. What do we get when we have universal beliefs across different political spectrums of American society? You get the ability for progressive movements to create changes across the aisle. What does this look like? We think if the words of the Declaration of Independence had been condemned in 1965, it would only have driven the country further into a divide. MLK instead used these shared values that they themselves were problematic when they were written because he knew that white America, in their ignorance, also believed in the cause that was written in the Declaration of Independence in the first place. Appeals to those shared values in the I Have a Dream speech were the vehicle by which the progressive movement made the radical reality. Without those, moderate senators would never have signed on to the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act because they would not have believed in the principle of the Declaration of Independence put forward. Contrast this to if they'd seen it as a flawed document, where the nuances were more important than the symbols that they preached. Their leanings would not have naturally been towards progressivism, it would have been towards the status quo. We think it's key here that we remind people that the goals of our nation are aligned with the goals that we see the Union for, and even if it wasn't necessarily what happened here. The second thing that's important to mention about this is that people can be easily convinced. If we've learned anything from the last couple months, is that the basic things that we consider America to be are not as solid as we used to believe that they were. That is to say that any belief that we currently hold is basically under fire. We think that ultimately, though, the good news is that no one is born with an inherent political opinion. Many of us can probably even remember going to school and hearing the story about the founding fathers or the history of the United States in a positive light. While obviously those are incredibly problematic portrayals, these morals are what create the bedrock of what our society believes in. When we venture to change them, we open a Pandora's box of negative opinions and stories that we tell to children who they themselves cannot internalize the nuance that we get here. What is the key distinction, and why does this lead to a worse society? We think when we explain that the Union was exclusively in the right and that the Confederacy was in the wrong, we set a foundation for them to do their own research without falling into the trap of believing in false flags like states' rights or property ownership. Contrast only leads students further towards an acceptance of the Confederacy's perspective rather than seeing the Union as a flawed actor and maintaining those beliefs. Those are fundamental things we need to discuss here. Secondly, we need to talk about what the Union was ultimately fighting for, because we think whether or not the day-to-day actions of the Union were moral, of course, is a debate that we don't think can effectively be had. But we talk about the portrayal of it is that we know that the Union stood for something that is incredibly critical in status quo. On January 6th, we experienced an event that hasn't happened for over 200 years in the United States. There was a breach of the US Capitol and an effective insurrection. That is an alert to us that Confederate sympathy is at an all-time high. Note then that when discussions over voter infringement, which is a valid issue in the United States, became more public this year, it wasn't the immediate nuance of the prison state that's guiding us towards that, or the fundamental bedrock of racism that underpins our country that conquered the headlines. Instead, the arsonists of hate quickly conquered that conversation, so much so that over 43% of Republicans think this election was outright stolen. We think that discussions of nuance when held in public spaces don't, again, go towards those areas where you'd like to see people consider it. It furthermore goes towards those biases that people hold. They are more likely to believe that the Confederacy is a better state if we aren't continually reminding ourselves of the values of the Union's victory. And let's characterize quickly what the Union was fighting for, because let's try and take our clues from who they were fighting against. 3 truths about the Confederacy that characterize what the Union was fighting for. Firstly, Jefferson Davis was elected not through Democratic votes, but only through a Confederate Congress who had a symbolic vote after, appointing him for the full 6-year duration of the Confederacy. Secondly, these states seceded immediately following a US presidential election. And thirdly, 10 of the 11 states didn't even allow Lincoln to be on the ballot because they didn't agree with the principles they believe in. What the Union and the story of the Union does is it convinces us that the arc of our history bends towards a collective and democratic outcome. At the very least, we can agree with this is what the Union was fighting for. This belief in American institutions and against separation proved to be so important just that 1 month ago or 2 months ago during the election, because the real heroes of that story were not the politicians at the top making arguments that were based on TV. It was the poll watchers, the vote counters, and the election officials who refused to be convinced by the conspiracy theories of American election fraud. As a result, It was, and many times when these people were asked why they did what they did, they talked about a collective duty to the United States. They talked about how the democratic principle they believed in since they were a kid was the reason they weren't willing to sacrifice country for party. This is the real strength and the importance of when we talk about the creation myth of the Union, because we only have 4 to 5 creation myths that define who we are as a country. So when we follow these, we make sure that there's going to be backstops against the denigration of our institutions. And very quickly, lastly, when those institutions are denigrated, it's not the wealthy or the white who are often most marginalized by this. It's the people who are the most often the victims of xenophobia when they are not protected by the law, who are more likely to be affected when we don't believe in those institutions. It is the 17,000 votes in Pennsylvania, in the most diverse areas of that state, that were taken away. They were the ones who were affected, not the rural voters in Ohio who were hurt when people lost faith in our institutions. For all those reasons, incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
I hope everyone can hear me okay. Before I start, I would also just like to thank everyone for coming. Over 110 people are here now. Thanks to Caleb and Daniel for coming and debating with us and doing what I think is a really important event, even though they don't get a free trip to Maine, which is, despite the cold, is at least somewhat more enjoyable than devoting an afternoon to sitting on Zoom in their rooms. So very grateful for them to show up. Thanks to Joey for organizing this, and very excited and honored to carry on the legacy of this event. So without further ado, I'll get started, and I'll start in 3, 2, 1. I want to clear up 2 things that I think Samuel is just straight up wrong about in his speech. First, I think that we can acknowledge shared values without necessarily portraying the Union as a righteous actor. I see absolutely no reason why we can't value the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment while also saying the Union was a deeply flawed moral actor and is not what we should be striving towards. Because I think that that is ultimately the question that we're talking about here, is what should we be striving towards? And I do not think that the Union is a particularly good model to base that off of. But secondly, I think that what Sam fails to mention is that truth inherently has value. I think all of the harms in the status quo that Samuel tells you about, things like the insurrection attempt, I think all of those stem from a fundamental disagreement about what is true. I think that in order to actually have any of the shared understanding, we have to have some level of devotion to critically interrogate our own history and to actually come to a set of truths that is reasonably representative about. I think insofar as they are literally defending lying to the general public about the legacy of the Union, they are not able to access any form of any solution that will actually make the world a better place. I think the crux of this debate is not just whether or not the Union was a superior moral actor compared to the Confederacy. I think that there are 2 questions to address within the debate. Was the Union a moral actor, and is it good to portray them as such? I think that Daniel and I are pretty cleanly winning on both of these. Let's start about whether the Union was moral, and I think the obvious answer is no, especially when the LO straight up says that the answer is no. I think Daniel makes it quite clear that both sides in the Civil War were extensions of the same white settler colonial legacy. Let's just talk about some of the facts about what happened with the Union's legacy and some instances of why they probably are not such a moral actor. The Union only banned slavery, which is probably their greatest moral accomplishment, as a PR stunt. If the Union had wanted to ban slavery, they could have done this at literally any point. But if you actually look at the specific moment when Lincoln had the political capital to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, it was in response to the United Kingdom considering providing support for the Confederacy as a means to reestablish their cotton supply. They did this because they knew that the United Kingdom would not get into a war, would not become involved if they were going to be on the side of slavery. Lincoln had to shift the narrative so that it was no longer a war about separation from the Union and was now a war about slavery. This was a PR stunt. It might have been a PR stunt that had an incredible moral upside, but it wasn't done out of the goodness of their hearts. As Daniel mentioned, Lincoln wanted to deport all Black Americans as a condition of their freedom. We still have forts named Hood and Braxton Bragg after Confederate generals. The Union, as it continued after the Civil War, not only continued without any major shift away from what it had been before the Civil War, but actively embraced elements of the Confederacy in its own rebuilding. The state of Tennessee has a bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest in the state capitol. Until a couple months ago, Mississippi flew the Confederate battle standard in their state flag. All of these are examples of how the Confederacy was not just put away, but was actively integrated into the Union. I think if you buy that the Confederacy was an immoral actor, then the Union necessarily is an immoral actor as well, merely because of the fact that they functioned as a direct extension of the Confederacy. But all of those are only things that demonstrate that the Union wasn't moral. I want to advance two more examples that demonstrate that the Union was actively morally bankrupt. First, Sherman's march and the strategy of total war burned down the city of Atlanta, a city that was not full of only white people. They pillaged the Georgia countryside and marched through the Carolinas. Recognize that the end result of this was probably good, but also that the moral of this action was incredibly bad. They burned down entire cities, they tore up infrastructure, and the state of Georgia never recovered from this. But I think secondly, and more importantly, was the Union's direct exploitation of the Civil War as an excuse to commit genocide towards Native Americans in Arizona and New Mexico by Union soldiers. The Union, under the pretense of hunting Confederate renegade forces in Arizona and New Mexico, sent in the Confederate column, the California column, California Confederate, basically the same, you know? But what they did there was effectively try to wipe out all of the Native American tribes that were in those areas. They used the pretense of hunting Confederates as an excuse to hunt Native Americans and to wipe out entire tribes and entire generations of people. I think that these are actions that at the very least require that we form a deeper interrogation of what the Union was as a moral actor. I think that we can say that any of these actions could have been justified. I think we can say that the end result of some of these actions was actively good. I don't, however, think that we can say de facto that the Union was an automatically morally righteous act. But that gets into the second question. Why is it bad that we spread this myth? Recognize that the seditionists who stormed the Capitol were not just waving Confederate flags. Excuse me, I don't know what that was. They were also waving American flags. This might seem at first to be contradictory, but as Daniel and I have consistently told you, those are two sides of the same coin. Those people view themselves as patriotic. They view themselves as fighting for the true values of the Union. In order for anything that side opposition has told you about to be true, they need to demonstrate that there is that common belief now, and that common belief has actually done some good. I don't think it has. I think that they need to demonstrate some sort of clearer harm that could befall us if we abandon this myth at the point where it's already not doing anything good. Union clearly was an imperfect actor. They were clearly a bad actor in a number of instances. And I think that at the very least, we need a deeper interrogation rather than simply acknowledging them as the morally righteous actor in a false dichotomy. Extremely proud to propose.
I'm so glad we have the opportunity to be joined by so many people today, and I thank everyone for their previous remarks. However, because we are obviously limited on time to a degree, I'm going to jump in and expose exactly why side government has failed to uphold their end of this debate. So let's begin. Starting off today, there's a mischaracterization done on side government when they refer to the Union when talking about a negative and immoral actor, particularly as this idea of a hero that Daniel presents. Daniel says that they are not the hero, and I agree, to the degree that which colonial settler states are inherently founded on the ideas of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenous policies, they are inherently bad actors. However, I'd like to redirect you to the motion. We are talking about the portrayal of the Union during the Civil War, not particularly the portrayal of the Union as the white settler state that we know. And I'd like to introduce you to the concept that side government has proven they've clearly never heard of, which is moral relativism. Morals are limited and defined, especially in sociological terms, and the ways in which our society sets norms, boundaries, and understanding of the ways the world works around us. These are generated not only as a product of our times, but by those we are surrounded by. Now, obviously, we have exceptions in the 1800s. We see communities like the Quakers who were very intently bound on the idea of abolition and that no one should be subjected to the horrors of slavery. And I believe we can all fundamentally agree with that. However, America was built on white supremacy. America was built on the propelling of white people through capital. And what we fundamentally have to understand is when we talk about the portrayal of narratives is that we're not looking at heroes versus villains, black versus white. We're looking at morally upright versus morally defunct. And while obviously you can point out many issues that exist in the Union, there's something fundamentally necessary in understanding that the Union at the time was the best thing that BIPOC had access to. Yes, we can address the fact, as Dylan says, there are horrible actions. However, we're not talking about the actor here. We're talking about what it means in the status quo for us to look at the Union as important because its values were fundamentally about crushing insurgency. I don't believe any of us here subscribe to this mythical idea that the Union had this vested interest in helping out Black and Indigenous populations. However, what we can agree with was that they were willing to stamp out the Confederacy. Now, this obviously didn't continue well into Reconstruction as they incorporated these people as fundamentally they were looking to reincorporate more white people back into the population. But there is something to be said for the way that we describe the events that happened on the 6th of this month. What we see is that when you allow people who are radically in opposition to the state itself, but not in a way that would guarantee, say, the retaking of lands by Native communities, the retaking and rebuilding of cities and capital by Black individuals, when you allow active and blatant white supremacists to engage in violence against the state, which with its many failures is the only form of protection that often exists for very vulnerable populations, we see that there's an important message to be learned here. All stories must have heroes and villains to effectively teach the morals in which we give. This is not about the morals of unity, about connectivity, about the ways in which we decolonize our mindsets. This is about what it looks like when we allow people who believe that they are not only above the law, but have the freedom to harass and harm those who are citizens of the state, to believe that they can intrude onto government spaces, onto government property, and destroy the lives of hardworking civilians. Fundamentally, the state has an obligation to protect all of its citizens. And whether the Union of that time would have advocated for people like me to be protected is irrelevant, because fundamentally the Union today must protect me and those who look like me. Even when it fails in that duty, it's its obligation. We are talking about a moral type of construct, what exactly it looks like to defend those who are most vulnerable and refuse to allow those who think they are above the law, who are above the will of the people, to perceive these. So moving on, what do we want to discuss in terms of the government's case? They talk about these impacts where we're left with this love it or leave it type society and this white saviorism. And I think it's very important to point out that Daniel is correct. We should not be worshiping or glorifying the state, the political actors that we see. There's no basis in which to basically praise these people, because effectively there is no moral perfection. There is no system in which we're all going to be happy with what we're going to be given, and the state can never undo what it has done to Black and brown bodies. However, what we can do is look back on our history and create an effective narrative. And this narrative doesn't really glorify the state. We're not asking for you to look at the Union as this beacon, this peak pillar, because as we know, there were many other countries that had already abolished slavery by this point. What we're asking for you to do is to look back and say, if the Confederacy had not been stopped, what happens? You allow for the continual growth of this already anti-state, anti-Black, and clearly anti-Indigenous, because regardless of whether the Union was engaging in harmful practices against Indigenous people, there's a guarantee that these same groups of white people living down south would have done the same thing. This is about what it looks like to protect those that are vulnerable. Obviously, the state has not been great at protecting BIPOC. We'd like to emphasize this, but it is important to talk about what the Union does represent, as Sam tells us. This is about defeating the South. This is about abolition. And whether abolition came foremost or it came secondarily, it was an outcome that came regardless. You can get into all the nitpicking about how the North continued to allow slavery in states such as Missouri to basically garner more support. But what's more important to talk about is the lives of those living in the South who were being fought for once this became a primary goal. While yes, it was necessary to include these people simply as a means of keeping the British off our backs, it's important to note that when you're advocating for people, whether you made the decision up front or you made it later on, it is now your responsibility. When we tell the story this way, what we tell the future generations, what we tell people today is that regardless of what you did in the past, it is now your obligation to protect, support, and keep comfortable the lives in which you have previously harmed. It is your responsibility to protect people from the most violent and discriminatory parts of white supremacy. While we cannot currently abolish all of these ideals within the current form of the state, what we understand is that this is the status quo. And in the status quo, we must do what is best for those who are most at risk. When Black people are being threatened by literal Nazis in the status quo, it is the obligation of the state to stamp these individuals out in the same way the Union attempted to stamp out the Confederacy. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. All right, so at this point in the debate, we have 2 speeches left, and something I like to do in these public debates is allow for the audience to participate, ask some questions, and then our last 2 debaters are going to sort of incorporate those questions and incorporate answers to those questions in their last speeches. So you can use the Q&A function. We have one here, and I'll read them aloud to the debaters while they prep for their final speeches. So we have a question: if opposition would obviously lose if the debate were right, were about whether the union's actions and motives were morally right, and people are easily able to infer this, then why would it be good to portray the union as something they were not? It seems like this would instead be cause for people who exhibit false and performative morality to justify their actions. I think this is a good question, and I'd like to see this answered as well. We'll wait a little bit for a couple more questions to come in. I think some good questions that people can be asking are, because it's a debate, we can't find a middle ground, but what could these worlds look like? What's a problem with going all in on one of these mindsets? These types of questions are really important in this type of debate where you have a binary, one or the other. So I encourage you all to participate, ask your questions so that they can be answered in the final speeches. We have a question. What standard should we use to determine whether a given actor is morally right? So what is morality? Who is morally right? Who's morally wrong? Should we consider the moral context of the era? I think this is another really good question, especially in the context of debates we've been having about art and past history, how we judge things from the past. So should we consider the moral context of the era, and how do we determine what is morally right and what is morally wrong? I think that's a really good question. Give it about another minute. If you have sort of, a half-finished thought, you can go ahead and post it now, just so we can try to stay on time here and finish up on schedule. In the meantime, I think some things that we can think about. Oh, wait, oh, sorry, they're just switching. Some other things that we can think about are, beyond just the context, but these specific actions, do the ends justify the means? And I think a lot of the debaters today have introduced a lot of arguments about what the intention of a lot of the actions on behalf of both sides was. And so I think that can be a really valuable type of question that the debaters can answer. But it looks like we're going to wrap up the Q&A. And I believe, we have one last question here. What is the difference between political perspective and political position? When you say people are not born into a political perspective, I do wonder if one is born into a political position, a body, race, gender, etc. I think that's another really good question, talking about sort of position within society and sort of our social locations. We have one here. Most tribes have sovereignty. How does the tribes of Maine show the union or crown rule today as a municipality? So again, coming back to the issue of the native genocide that occurred, which has been touched on a little bit. I think these are all really good questions. And The theme for MLK Day this year is confronting our history, justice for coming times. With this in mind, how does the way we teach and portray history allow us to access justice and equity for future generations? So sort of a forward-facing question. A lot of this debate has incorporated the events of the past week this, I guess, 2 weeks ago, and sort of the echoes of the past. So I think facing forward, looking to the future, how can we change? We have one here. Good points were brought up about the usefulness in a superficial or flawed narrative in teaching lessons to young people. Where is the line where that usefulness is outweighed by the harmfulness or of the lack of truth? So can you lie in the pursuit of morality? Can you distort history to make a point, essentially? So we're going to wrap up the Q&A. I think our debaters are ready. But thank you everyone for participating, and we have 2 speeches left.
Unless Sam, you want to go first on this one, I think I take it from here. And to get started, I think we got a lot of good questions concerning the implications of, 1, where this debate takes place, on what ground are we having this argument, and then 2, kind of the real world implications of the debate that we're having. So thanks to the audience for that. Firstly, I think one of the most important questions we get is concerning, 1, the theme that we have this year for this debate series, which is confronting our history. And I'll get a bit more into that concerning this 2 sides of the same coin argument that Dylan and I have expounded upon. But the first question we got is, why portray the Union as something they weren't? Insofar as the Union was the same implications concerning manifest destiny and this kind of concerning ideal of using the Black body as a means of achieving policy goals, both militarily as well as politically, why address the Union and why treat the Union as an actor that it was not? And I think concerning the opposition case, I think they have to do more work here to tell us why it's necessarily good that we consider the Union to be a morally righteous actor when we've shown clearly that they are not, in both their deeds and in their political ideology. But also concerning this idea of going further than the analogy of, but what do we tell our children? Because I think we can have a larger vision of an aspirational patriotism, if you will. This idea concerning that the fact that the American canon features a lot of history in which whiteness is placed front and center, in which racism and even, concepts concerning ethno-nationalism and certain concerning instances like that have been placed at the forefront. And this idea that oftentimes, even today, when we go across the world and we send soldiers off to countries within the global South, we are often not greeted as the liberators that George Bush would, quote unquote, misunderestimate us to be. This idea concerning the fact that in a lot of different stories concerning the international implications of our actions, concerning the actions of the US government here at home, we are not the good guys of our own story. We are not the protagonists of our own story. And I think it's important to understand that, because it then does not push people to the right like we get from Sam, this idea concerning the fact that we're going to radicalize all the Trumpies in waiting kind of concept, but rather it creates a situation in which minorities, people of color, individuals who occupy the margins of society, mind you, are put into a place in which they understand that it is okay to be critical of their country. It is okay to question the motives of a government when it acts historically. It is okay to try and expect more from a government that's founding document is said by each and every person in that country to apply to you as an individual. That kind of aspirational patriotism, to understand that we have not historically been the good guy, but there is a means with which we can reclaim that kind of moral mantle that we have always fallen short of in terms of our actions historically. I think that is something that is net good in today's debate. And I think that's something that you get uniquely on the government side. This idea concerning the fact that if we're honest with ourselves, we get a better historical understanding of what our actions are, and that historical understanding allows us to act in a means that is better informed. We often wonder why we have stories concerning the abuses of individuals abroad by the US military, or why we have instances of rampant racism and sexual assault within the US military, or why we have instances in which the US government has been seen with sitting government members, sitting members of school boards, sitting members of educational institutions, committing an armed insurrection at our Capitol, waving Confederate flags, waving American flags, and even more worrying aspects in which we've seen individuals who were using anti-Semitic language, anti-Black language that was very blatant, and calling for the hanging and lynching of sitting US government members. That in itself is especially problematic, but that comes from a history in which you have a situation wherein the American canon is one that is infallible. This idea concerning the fact that we are a white state intended for white people, and that white people in this country should act in their corporeality as though they own everything. And I think that's the especially problematic paradigm that you get when you don't teach individuals their history. It's the especially problematic paradigm that is a continuation of the disenfranchisement of US soldiers who happen to be Black, and after the urging of abolitionists at the time saying, allow Black men to enlist in the US military, were not allowed to until it became politically beneficial for the Union and their backs were up against the wall. This idea concerning the fact that the US government will consistently use Black and brown bodies as a means of achieving initiatives is something that directly starts kind of at the beginning of the Civil War and the discourse that comes immediately after. In terms of the differentiation between the opposition case and the government case, a few things on this to address the questions concerning the standards and how we get to this ends justify the means mentality that we get from the opposition. Here's what we're going to do. First thing, there's two sides of the same coin argument. I think in order for the Union to have been a morally righteous actor, or to even deserve the kind of credibility to be considered a morally righteous actor historically, they would have to be fundamentally different from the goals of the Confederacy. So in terms of race relations and considering Black Americans and to be full citizens or to even be human by this period in time, the South and the North are in agreement that Black individuals were not human, that they constituted 3/5 of a human being, and that they did not deserve any sort of political capital or political agency as a direct result of that. In terms of the political support immediately after, it was clear at the South and the North, when it came to the political coalitions that they formed immediately after the Civil War and during the Civil War, were in community, not with the Black and brown bodies of the enslaved individuals in this country, or the Native Americans that Manifest Destiny used the Civil War to extend out west towards genocide and kill those populations, but rather they were in agreement concerning the state of this country being a very white one, concerning it being one that is inherently pro-white in its hand. Concerning the post-war attitudes in these cases, we saw that slavery in this country did not functionally end. We still have prisoners in this country that are enslaved. We have individuals in California, what I guess today would be considered to be a northern state, or a state reserved for the coastal elites, as some Republicans would call it. But in those cases, we have enslaved firefighters protecting property of the rich and the famous in the Hollywood Hills, risking their own lives for nothing. They can't be employed after they've paid their debt to society. We have situations in which the furniture that was destroyed at the Capitol was made by prison labor. And then in the instances in which individuals who were often Black and brown in this country, cleaning up after the insurrectionist mess that we saw just days ago, we saw that they were cleaning up the remains of furniture made in prisons where individuals are functionally enslaved in this country, and that in itself is problematic. And it's because of the fact that slavery only became a Civil War issue in which the bodies of Black and brown Americans in this country became a political tool that was advantageous for them. And the fact that we have an obligation to a realistic patriotism, we have an obligation to speak truth to history, we have an obligation to be very blunt with ourselves concerning whether or not we would like to embrace a very clear and honest aspirational patriotism, that we believe we get a better country, we believe we get a better history, and we believe we get a better version of the truth on side government. Thank you.
Hello, once again, can everyone hear me okay? Great. I want to thank just one more time for Morehouse, for Joey, and everyone else for establishing this event. Again, it is an incredible privilege to be associated with this sort of organization and just the kind of day that this has been. I hope that there are many more conversations about this long into the future. Great. So just to recharacterize this debate, what's important in an unfortunate reality of the American political spectrum is that when one idea is presented, it is almost always contrasted with an opposite and opposing idea. That is to say, in absence of the Union being a true moral actor, the suggestion most people get is that the Confederacy is not as bad because there's not something to oppose it. This is something we state in the beginning of my speech that Caleb says very eloquently, and I think still continues now. The key is that the specter of Confederacy is rising in this nation, and we need every single person in this country able to fight it who will. We cannot afford anything less. On to the questions that you asked, because they're excellent and definitely get at the heart of this debate. First thing, I'm going to group these two questions about morality and about whether or not the union being a moral good is something that we can talk about in a way that might be not as nuanced as we'd prefer. Two things. Firstly, the way that we like to look at this morality-wise is what Caleb brings to you, which is that relative morality allows us to focus on good deeds that make our society built off those good deeds versus simply considering everything to be imperfect and not having a consensus around whether or not certain things are good or not. Note the example I bring to you, which also responds to many things that is brought up in the MG speech about the Capitol Hill rioters, which is that when you increase the discussion of voter suppression, it didn't end up in a circumstance in which everyone in the United States thought we should abolish the prison system, or B, we should work on the issue of gerrymandering. It ended in a scenario in which bigots on social media were capturing the conversation to make it all about how the state was imperfect and how the Democrats were stealing the election. This is what happens when you interject this into American political discourse, and the consequence of this is twofold. Firstly, we saw that our election was very nearly overturned in many stages of the electoral process. And secondly, it means that the people living in these areas with other people who are bigoted, who are now mobilized by this, or people who are now moderate, who are now pushed further right by these lies that they have become to believe, are now living in circumstances that are significantly more difficult. Caleb explains to you that even if the state is a flawed actor, it is often the only protection. When we talk about Brown versus Board, or we talk about other areas of American society where the laws are the only protections that people and BIPOC people are able to actually access in the first place. That is to say that we need to protect those institutions that do at least something to protect people who are in difficult situations in our society. If we don't fight this with everything, it doesn't work. And lastly, the union was a great example of how you need to fight white supremacy and the worst impacts of human hate and bigotry with every single force that you have available to you. Of course, the bloodiest war in American history. It is obviously something that shows that example. The second thing was about perspective, whether this changes based on who you are. I think this is an excellent point. Unfortunately, some things get lost in the nuance of debate, but it's a great reminder for us all to consider, which is to say that when you are born into a certain identity, for example, my own biracial identity, I have no doubt that it has changed the way I see the world. When my mom would tell me stories about racism at her job when she was growing up, that is something that definitely affects the way that I walk through this planet every single day. So it's important to mention here that I think what I was trying to suggest in my speech was simply that the stories that we tell can make a difference. That's why, for example, elevating BIPOC voices is such an important task that we always have to uphold, because when people hear those stories, we can reduce bigotry across wherever you are able to spread those voices. That is incredibly key, and we need to make sure that that continues to happen. It's a great question. The third thing was about tribes, and I think this is also a great question to ask, which is just how can we make a society better than it is currently? And I think that obviously we should be focused on doing that and making sure that we are considering the perspectives of everyone when doing so. The fourth question here, and I apologize, my writing is not exactly the best, but the fourth question here is about the theme of MLK Day and how this conflicts with this or fits into it then. I think that the way that we teach history is obviously an incredibly nuanced thing. What we can recognize is our failures when teaching history. They brought up the example of the Capitol Hill rioters and how they were waving both Confederate flags and American flags. If you understood history, you would know that those things are entirely incongruous. But the difficulty here is that nuance is not always injected into American classrooms. We are incredibly privileged to be having discussions on this level that happen often at institutions that are difficult to get into. Obviously, Bates is an institution that costs a lot of money, and our white supremacist history is something that makes it a difficult place for many of us to exist in. As a result of this, it's important to note that this nuance is not existing across the country. When we talk about those stories that are taught to children, we're talking about families who exist in areas that don't have the funds to go to a private school or don't have the funds to go to a school that might be able to teach them those individual nuances. And therefore, they get a smaller story that we would prefer was entirely beneficial to the Union and against the Confederacy, than one that might have nuance that would lead someone into being more likely to turn from moderate into a far right individual that hurts everyone who is on the other side. The last thing here is about whether or not lying is good. I don't think necessarily that we are lying in our efforts here. What we tell you in the first speech that I give you is that the conception that people have of the Union is firstly that it abolished slavery, which is a truism, and Caleb explains why, even if it didn't do it in the best way, recognizing an institution that was literally the stain in the original sin of our nation, the group that got rid of that and praising them for that leads us into the belief that those human rights need to be upheld into the future. So even if the actual organization was not perfect, that belief and that moral is still critical. The second thing was defeating the Confederacy, which we both agree is obviously an important thing. And the third thing was the maintenance of the Union. We tell you that the belief in American democracy was what changed certain people from making the election, or believing that the election was stolen and turning those votes into an election that would not have actually gone through. It was individual poll watchers and election officials who made this election as secure as it ended up being. If they didn't, again, have those beliefs, that wouldn't have happened. The last thing here is just that if the Union is portrayed as good, won't that also just continue to uphold the Confederacy? What are the tangible beliefs of this? I think what we see here is that there is a dichotomy in American society, and that when you don't fill up the airwaves with statements about how there is a need for human rights, how there is a need for the society to be seen as one that is democratic, that you get more people rising up and creating opposition. That's why banning Trump off Twitter has reduced like the election information by 73% in just a couple weeks that it's happened. There needs to be a concerted effort by everyone in society to make sure that we are opposing these ideals. To close out this debate, I just want to first thank the government, the audience, and everyone else for being a part of this debate. It's an important discussion. But what we'd like to say here is that it's important to note that we're talking about the portrayal and the conversations that happen here. We cannot accept any world in which things get worse, because that means they were going to have a worse scenario for those that are least well off in our society. We need to protect those voices, protect those livelihoods, and make sure that we are always focusing on what is best and the morals that we chase, regardless of whether or not we get there. We need to always chase the ones that we know are best. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you again to the other team.
All right. Thank you everyone so much for coming out today. We appreciate Daniel, Dylan and Samuel for debating, and especially Daniel and Caleb for coming back to continue this tradition. We hope you continue the conversation that was started here today. Make sure to check out the final program tonight and have a good evening. Thank you.